Can I just start with one quick thought for you all? It's just this. Thanks for being here. I got to tell you, I drove up at the appointed hour here about 45 minutes ago. Came out to the front door Sunday morning on a college campus. There wasn't a soul around. Nobody going in and out of the doors. There were no cars around. I saw 2 buses on the other side of the building as I drove around, fearing either it's not today or it's someplace else and I'm 45 minutes away from where I'm supposed to be in 30 minutes. Finally, I drove around and I saw all of these buses parked about 6 blocks away where I guess they've got them staged. This actually has some meaning because we wanted to do a number of things this year for this year of faith. You remember that Pope Emeritus Benedict, who resigned his office about 7 months ago, had called this year of faith, proclaimed it about a year ago. And so we wanted to use that precisely with that opening line of the gospel today, saying to the Lord, increase our faith. And the Holy Father asked us to do that. So we sat down to say, as a diocese, what can we do to use this year of faith? How can we make it alive? And so we've done a number of things. I'm very grateful for my brother priests who are here, some of your pastors who are here, because one of the things that we did is we asked the parishes to help with the year of faith throughout the year. Particularly, Pope Emeritus Benedict asked us to reread some of the documents of the Church from the famous Second Vatican Council, but various different things. Well, at a certain point, we said, we need to do something for our young people as well. And there were some voices that were saying, well, that's all good, but we're not sure that they're going to come. And some others said, no, trust them. Trust their faith. So here you are. Here we are. And can I say that your bishop is really proud to be here with you. But it's not just that I'm glad that you're here. I'm glad that today, in various different ways, before the Mass, the Q&A afterward, and what follows, we and you are going to have a chance to talk about something that maybe we don't talk about directly often enough. And that is precisely our faith. Yes, our Catholic faith. Yes, the faith of the Church. But I'm getting to something even more personal. It is that element, that act of faith within your heart and mind that unites us together and links us to our Catholic faith and links us to Jesus Christ. And by the way, that is a hugely important point. Jesus Christ, your Catholic faith, and the Church, they go together. They flow together. They are the same thing. We are the mystical body of Christ. And those two things can't ever be separated. One of the reasons that I'm really glad we have this chance to think and talk together about the faith is, especially when you're young, faith can be hard. We know how that is. You know, when you're young, you want so much to belong to something, and yet there are doubts, there are insecurities. You don't want to be excluded from anything. You don't want to exclude anybody for any reason. And then there's Jesus, who's so real, sometimes sort of. He can seem so distant. We're told, for example, that it is our faith that here at the Mass, He will be present. The bread becomes His body, the wine becomes His blood. And yet sometimes if we pray before the tabernacle, that hour of adoration that we're going to have, Sometimes it can seem that the tabernacle, that the Eucharist doesn't speak back. Although it does. We have to listen in a different way with our hearts. But it's that whole faith that you and I are here to talk about today, and to answer that cry of the gospel, increase our faith. Can I ask you, how many of you here have read the Chronicles of Narnia? Not seen the movie, read the books. Good. I'll tell you why I like the Chronicles of Narnia. By C.S. Lewis, by the way. If you haven't read them, put it on your list. Because what it is a retelling of the story of faith of Jesus Christ for young people, from the standpoint of young people, from the eyes of young people, and not from adults. Those of you who've read the books, and maybe you've seen the movies, but the movies don't do enough justice to it. They're good, but there are those young people, Lucy, Edmund, Susan, and Peter. And in the Chronicles of Narnia, we read about their growth in faith. We read about, yes, their mistakes, and that makes them so human. I can identify with that. But we read about something else. The great deeds of the faith of young people. That, I want to say, is our point of our gathering today. You are called to great deeds even as young people in your faith. So get ready. You know, in the Chronicles of Narnia, those young people are given a task of being leaders. They are entrusted with the task of guiding and protecting a kingdom and creation that is given to them. And they do it, even in their mistakes and in their growth, with a real sense of their own dignity. Not because they're sort of thinking about how good or smart or cute they are personally, because the one thing you begin to see is they know better. They're not distracted by that. They know of their dignity because it's been entrusted to them by the lion, by Aslan, by the figure of Christ who is constantly reappearing throughout the stories. And those young people know that they have to keep their dignity pure. They know that they have to watch over this creation, this life that has been entrusted to them. Does it sound familiar? That dignity and that task leads them to fun and joy. It leads them to travels to faraway places. It leads them even to rescue others as young people from the enslavements of sin. And finally, as young people, they are led even to combat, where they can be wounded, and even give their lives for Christ. Those are, in many different ways, the great deeds of faith that are in front of you as well. You know, I think of the challenges to your faith today. I think they're harder than mine were at your age. I'm an old guy. In my time, years ago, I think it's fair to say, our country, our society had a clearer view of what's right and what's wrong. Yes, we understand not everybody agreed totally on every single thing. The world will not be perfect until He comes again. But growing up, I knew very well what my parents and what other adults frowned upon. And even if everything wasn't linked directly to the faith, there was a clear sense that supported us of what was God's right and God's wrong. And for young people, that was something that helped us to grow in faith. Your challenge is more difficult. Because now right and wrong seem to change almost all the time in the world. It seems like the only thing that's really wrong sometimes is to stand up and say, I believe, I will follow Jesus, I will live my faith. To say that there is a right and a wrong that comes from God, and not simply what we have decided or what we might undecide next week. And what makes it harder is that you as young people are special targets today for the world that wishes to draw us away from Christ. The world wants to pull you away from Christ. They want to pull you away from your Catholic faith because they want to pull you away from any chance that you will do the great deeds of faith. They're trying to do it cleverly, trying to give all of us ideas and words that confuse right and wrong, and good and evil. Because they know when we're confused, if we're ever uncertain, it's much harder to do the great deeds of faith than if you're absolutely convinced that hill has to be taken, this thing has to be done. This is how God wants us to live. And that's one of the reasons our gathering today is so important as a part of the year of faith. All of us here are here because we love the Catholic Church and what she teaches us. And so my point to you is, look around. Look around this room right now. Look at all the young people who have come, gotten up early this morning, gathered here, and soak it in. Because the message of this is the same thing when, if any of you have ever gone to your World Youth Day or you've gone to the March for Life, there's this same message. I am not alone. I'm not the only one. Because that's another thing that makes it harder to carry out as a young person the great deeds of faith. When together we follow the church, we don't have any need to be confused or uncertain. You know, let's look for a minute at how this same understanding is what we find in the readings this morning. Especially that second reading of St. Paul is a reading, yes, it's to Timothy, but in a very real way, it is a letter of St. Paul to young people. Part of that is just the circumstance. Paul is writing this letter as it presents itself to us as an old man now. He is imprisoned. He's waiting sort of the final clarification on his sentence. His day is over. He knows what's coming. And so he writes this letter to the young Timothy. This is the young disciple that he loves so much that, in effect, what we have being written before us is an old man like me passing the torch to a young person like you. That's the context of this second reading. Paul knows it's Timothy's time for the great deeds. And so he's giving him instructions. And he's worried about a couple of things as he writes this. He is worried that as a young person, Timothy is already beginning to feel a little overwhelmed, and he wants to address that. And he's afraid that Timothy is seeing the challenges to be too much before him. And so Paul writes to give him the courage, the encouragement to carry out the great deeds of faith. Listen to what he says. He starts that portion of the letter that we read for the second reading by saying this: stir into flame the gift of God that you have. Young people, stir into flame the gift of God that you have, the grace that has been given to you. What does that imply? What does it mean? Obviously, the image is like a campfire. Paul's point is, you have the flame. You have the coals already within you. And if it can be said you can stir it up, that means the faith isn't just going to happen. It means you have to contribute. You have to stir it up. It means you have the ability to stir up the flame, or to dampen it down, or even to crush it out. Our year of faith, our summit today, is to help each of us stir up the faith that resides in our hearts and in our lives. And Paul goes on, God did not give us a spirit of cowardice, but a spirit of power and love and self-control. The point is this: we can't be afraid. You can't be cowards. That's important, because who of us hasn't ever felt the temptation not to be strong? The temptation to go along with the crowd. Maybe even to join in when we shouldn't, just in order to be accepted. We know the kinds of issues where we can feel that fear. Feel the cowardice that doesn't make us strong. Drinking, purity, drugs, talk that hurts or tears down another, skipping Mass. But Paul says to Timothy, to you, you have been given a grace of power, of love, of self-control. Love others. Love all others. Because this is what Jesus has told us to do. But we do it according to God's plan. And think and pray about the gift of self-control that you've received. Be confident. You have Christ behind you, beside you, before you. You do not have to give in to anything that is a temptation, that might frighten us, that might take us away. You have the strength not to do it. And here is one of the great deeds that is entrusted to you. Here are your battles not to give in. Not in spite of being young, but because you are young. You must lead by living out your Catholic faith. Paul goes on with something that's kind of the same thing. He then goes on to Timothy to say, do not be ashamed of your testimony to the Lord. Probably every one of us has been in a moment, a situation, where there's somebody standing in front of us who criticizes us or disapproves of our faith or how we live it. Those are one of those moments where you can begin to feel a little bit reticent. But just remember, just as you can see that person in front of you, Christ is there with you. Do not be ashamed of him. You know, it's that shame of Christ that is one of the great tools that Satan can use in the world today to take people away from Christ, to take people away from the great deeds of faith. It is intimidation. And here's Paul's word to the young Timothy. Don't be intimidated. Don't let anyone intimidate you about your life of Catholic faith in Jesus Christ. And then Paul, in prison, writing perhaps in his last days, tells the young Timothy, bear your share of the hardship of the gospel. Pope Francis has had a number of talks in his first 6-7 months with young people. You know, he had all those talks, especially when he went to Rio for the Youth Day. But he's had others. He did a confirmation and he talked to young people there. And he's had one thing to say time and time and time again to young people. The same thing Paul is saying to Timothy, to you. Don't be afraid to swim upstream. There may be hardships in order to be faithful. There might be difficulties. But Paul's point to the young Timothy is, don't be surprised by that. Jesus gives you the strength to stir up that flame of faith. And then he goes on to Timothy. Guard this rich trust. It is a trust. Faith that has been given to you like it was given to Timothy. You're the guardian of it. You have been given this pearl beyond all price. You have been given this great treasure. Guard it well. One day, Jesus is going to ask each one of us, how did you guard the faith that I entrusted to you? Let's talk about it. Tell me about it. That's why you, like the young Timothy, are called to these great deeds. Let me leave you with one special challenge of my own. One idea maybe to bury in your heart at the moment, and to bring it out later. But I think it is one of the great tests of faith, particularly for young people, and that is this. I want to ask you to be willing to go to Mass by yourself, if necessary. To be willing to go to confession without a group. Here's why I put this out. We are told time and again that where young people walk away from the faith and lose their faith is especially about the ages of about 18 to 23, somewhere in there. And we can understand why that is. Those are the ages when a lot of young people, instead of having a whole group like this, go away to college, or get a job, or have various different things, that suddenly they're not around the house and not with the family as much as they were before. Suddenly it becomes a question of, what is your value? What have you taken to your heart personally? It brings the challenge on Saturday night or Sunday morning and on holy days of obligation of getting up and going to Mass because you have taken that value to heart. Because you have said, yes, the Lord being present on the altar, Holy Thursday night, Christ's crucifixion, again, sacramentally, all of that coming together on the altar. Yes, I must be there. It takes the courage of Timothy. Sometimes it can even take courage to go to Mass on Sunday when you're in your family. We know, too, that for the same reasons, confession, reconciliation, can disappear from the life of young people for years. This is my challenge. Even if no one else is around who will go to Mass with you, you must come. You must make that to be one of the great deeds of your faith. And it's a concrete test of faith. To go to confession is to remind ourselves of those moments again and again in the gospel when we hear Christ turn to someone and say, your sins are forgiven. Christ only does that in this direct way through the priest. The sacrament that is offered to us. Yes, there are other means. But if we are not going to the sacrament of confession, our friendship with Christ is not what it needs to be. It's not being purified. It is another great deed of the faith. Brothers and sisters, it all comes down to this. And I hope this day so reinforces this. Be proud of your love for Jesus Christ. Be proud of the gift of your Catholic faith. And go forth and and do the great deeds of faith that only the young can do.